The dust of the NHL trade deadline has finally settled, and it's time to start talking playoffs.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. I am Nick Sarash, joined by my co-host Hunter Hodes, and today we're going to break down which teams are most likely to win the Stanley Cup and why. A lot of that has to do with which conference they play in. We're going to talk about the recent form of two teams that we kind of pronounced dead a while ago in Nashville and the Islanders, and we're going to kick two more teams off the island of relevancy. So when I opened the link to vote in the poll this week, I was very happy to see the question phrased this way. Not which team is the best, which team is most likely to win the Stanley Cup, because those are two very different conversations. A lot of the time we talk about the best teams in the context of, who has the best record, but the question being phrased as who's most likely to win the Stanley Cup, that adds another layer to the conversation. It's not just who's good, it's who meets certain types of thresholds, what types of players they have, goaltending, if you're you're a goaltending truther, and what's your path look like. And that's where it starts to get interesting, especially in the Western Conference. So I turn it over to you. How much weight do you put into the path, or do you generally feel that the best team more likely than not is going to prevail?
Yeah, so I think for the Stanley Cup playoffs, I feel like it's a bit of both. I mean, to me, part of the playoffs is luck-based. These series are such short sample sizes where anything can happen. Heck, we saw the Florida Panthers, who were basically the 8th seed in the playoffs last year, and they steamrolled the entire Eastern Conference on their way to the Stanley Cup final. I mean, yeah, they had a really tough series against the Boston Bruins, but then they're able to crush the Maple Leafs. They crushed the Hurricanes as well in the Eastern Conference final. They made things look really, really easy after that Bruins series. And yeah, I know they lost to the Vegas Golden Knights, but truly anything can happen in the playoffs. But I also do think you need the right path. And speaking of the Panthers, I think they have arguably the best path to the final again this year. Well, I wouldn't even say again, but I think for this year, they have the best path to the final. Right now, 45, 17, and 4, 94 points. That's good for the number one seed in the Eastern Conference. If the playoffs started today, they would be taking on the New York Islanders, who are the second wildcard team. They have the tiebreaker right now over the Red Wings, who have full-on collapse, Nick. I mean, that is something that I really didn't see coming at this point. They've lost 6 in a row. The Islanders have started to wake up a little bit under Patrick Waugh. I would definitely take the Panthers to win that series over the Islanders. But then in the second round, you would probably get the winner of Boston-Toronto. And that would be pretty interesting, to say the least. I would still take the Panthers to win that series, but I think it's going to be close. And then in the Metro, you'll probably get the winner, Rangers, Carolina, something like that. But I think the Panthers in the East have the best possible path to the final. You can make an argument for the Rangers as well. I mean, you look at the standings right now, they will be taking on the Lightning if the playoffs started today. And if the Lightning are able to get at least healthier for the playoffs, Nick, I do think that could be a tough series for the Rangers, considering the amount of high-end talent that the Lightning have. But right now, if we're talking strictly based on path, I would say the Panthers have the best one to the final. But again, anything can happen in the playoffs because these are such short sample sizes.
And it's interesting to conduct this exercise in this way because generally speaking, when I talk about ranking the teams, I try and put them in groups because generally there's not a huge amount of separation, between the second, third, fourth best, like in that top tier, the contender tier where we're talking about most likely. You mentioned a handful of them. You mentioned Florida. You mentioned the Rangers. Then you've got the 6 teams that are currently in playoff spots, in the divisional playoff spots out west, where Vegas, Edmonton, Vancouver, Dallas, Colorado, Winnipeg. I'm still going to put Winnipeg on there. I know they lost to Nashville last night, didn't look great, but they also played really well earlier in the week. So Winnipeg, Colorado, Dallas, Vancouver. I feel a lot of us are still, and I didn't know if I wanted to put Edmonton in this tier. I have a tier that's just until I see it, I won't believe it, which should probably include Edmonton. And in that tier, I have Carolina and Toronto, where fundamentally talented rosters, good teams, but they haven't broken through. We've seen pretty similar iterations of these teams, of Carolina, of Toronto, and of Edmonton over the last number of years. And, not a lot to show for it. There's a conference final appearance in there for Carolina. Toronto won their first playoff series in forever last season. And Edmonton hasn't been past the second round in quite a while. So it's a real conversation as to, for teams like that are constructed in that manner, especially when they try and recreate goaltending in the aggregate, and not the idea being, if they play well enough in front of them. Excuse me, no, I'm wrong. They went to the conference final a couple years ago in they lost to Colorado. That's right. Edmonton lost to Colorado 2 years ago, and then before that, they hadn't been past the second round in quite a while. But yeah, when we're talking about these teams like Edmonton, Toronto, Carolina, until I see them, make a conference final and then get a conference final, 6-7 games against a good team, or make the cup final, I'm going to have a hard time believing that this year is that much different from any other year.
Right. And, Carolina obviously made the Eastern Conference final last year, Nick, but they didn't even win a game off the Florida Panthers, as I said. That team, I feel like they're built for a lot of regular season success. And yeah, they can have some playoff success, but until they get a true bona fide superstar, I'm just
Jake
not going to
Gensel
take
not a
them
superstar, Hunter?
you know me. I love Jake Gensel. He's everything they've needed for a while and more, but I still feel like they need another bona fide superstar on that team, because I don't think Gensel is going to be re-signing there after the season. So once he probably leaves, they're still going to be short a true superstar. And I just can't take the Hurricanes fully seriously until they add that type player. I mean, they tried to get Elias Pettersson out of Vancouver, and that would have made all the sense in the world. Nick, he is everything they've been lacking and more as well, outside of Gensel, who's a pure finisher. But that trade would have made a lot of sense for Carolina and potentially would have put them over the top in the Eastern Conference. Outside of the Panthers, though, I have Colorado my number 2, Vancouver my number 3, Vegas on my number 4, Rangers at 5, Stars at 6. I can interchange Vegas and Vancouver. Honestly, you could easily make an argument for that. Vegas, again, is all in. I love how they operate at the trade deadline. I've been a big fan of the Canucks all year. I actually like their path as it stands right now. In the Western Conference, they have 92 points, which is good for the top seed in the West. If the playoffs started today, they will be taking on, funny enough, the Vegas Golden Knights. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't think the Knights are going to finish in that second wildcard spot, which is why I will like Vancouver's path. Right now, I think it'll be a bit dicey. But I'm assuming that Vegas is going to overtake Los Angeles for that third spot in the Pacific, which will really help Vancouver's odds at the end of the season going to the playoffs, because them going against a team, for example, like the LA Kings is better than going up against a juggernaut like Vegas. So assuming that happens, I like Vancouver's path quite a bit to the final. Colorado right now, they're tops in the Central Division with 89 points. If the playoffs started today, they will be taking on the Nashville Predators. I'm going to take Colorado to win that series every time. Then they'll take on the winner of Dallas, Winnipeg. I still think Colorado is better than both of those teams. And if they're able to get Landeskog back in May or April, that's going to be huge for them overall. I have the Rangers in there, obviously, too. I think outside of Florida, they're the top team in the Eastern Conference. I'll say this about the Rangers, Nick. If they don't go on a deep run this year with how mid the Eastern Conference is, I really don't know when the Rangers are going to go on a deep run in this era with Panarin, Fox, Shesterkin, all the other talent that they have, because the conference this year is not nearly as good as it was last year and the year before.
Completely agreed with you in regards to the Rangers. And frankly, you could argue the same thing about the Leafs, where if there were ever a year to make something happen, this would be it, where this is clearly the weakest Bruins team, maybe in the last 15 years, prior to them winning the Stanley Cup. This is probably the weakest iteration of the Bruins since that. So I definitely agree with you. The one thing I want to touch on in this subject before we take a break and we move on, we talk about the Islanders, the Predators, the Red Wings, who you mentioned, who are struggling as of late. I hate this format. I genuinely despise the divisional playoff format, and it robs us of good opportunities. Dallas, Colorado as a conference final would be incredible. Vegas against either of those teams would be incredible. But based on the way this format is set up, you have your best matchups in the second round of the playoffs, which is not what anybody wants. I talk about this all the time. The Nashville Winnipeg series in 2018 is probably the best playoff series I've ever watched. And that was a second round series. Winnipeg won, and then they were so dead by the end of that series, they lost to Vegas in the conference final. Expansion first year Vegas. I don't like this format in the slightest. And in the West this year, it's going to knock serious contenders out in the first and second round. Where, like you mentioned, based on who's in the first place spot, and that's why it's really important if you're in the Central or the Pacific to win your division, because you're going to avoid a better matchup till at least the second round. I know, the Kings and the Predators aren't slouches in those wild card slots, but that's a hell of a lot better than playing Dallas or Winnipeg, and that's a lot better than playing Edmonton or Vancouver in the first round. So you really want to win your division this year if you can in the West.
It's an unserious format that's run by an unserious
Yeah.
league. I mean, I've been saying that for as long as they implemented this format. What, Nick? It was a decade ago when they had
Just
the format
about,
for the
yeah.
first time. I believe it was the 2013-14 season, if I recall correctly. I've never liked it. I mean, the Penguins, when they made their second run to the Stanley Cup in 2017, the second of the back-to-back, they played the Columbus Blue Jackets in the first round. Do you know what both those records were? They were two of the top 5 best teams in the league going at it in the first round, just because the Washington Capitals were that good that year. The Penguins got second in the Metro, the Blue Jackets got third. But it's just, you're not rewarding teams for how they did in the regular season. You're punishing them. And that's not what you should be doing for the playoff format. I would like to go back to 1 versus 8. I think that's the better format. If you want to go full chaos, you can have the top seeds pick who they play. I think that would also be quite entertaining and honestly hilarious, but the format is just not it. It was the same thing in 2016 and 2017 as well for the Penguins when they played the Washington Capitals in the second round. That would have been an all-time Eastern Conference final both years, but because of this dumb format, they had to play in the second round. I just never liked it in general. It does not reward regular season success. Heck, as I said just a few minutes ago, if the playoffs were to start today, the Canucks would be taking on the Vegas Golden Knights in the first round because the Knights are in that second wildcard spot. They're tied with the Kings, but the Kings have the tiebreaker, I guess, right now. I don't want to see that series in the first round. I'm sorry. I don't. I want to see that series in the second round or in Western Conference final. It's just they don't reward regular season success right with this playoff format. And it needs change. And heck, even some of the players don't really like it either.
No, I completely agree with you. And that last point you made was really good. It does not reward regular season success. It amplifies the variance of the postseason by making better teams play each other earlier in the format. It makes the regular season mean less. And that's what we've been pounding the drum of saying. The NHL doesn't have a lot of parity. There are just a lot of mediocre teams. Those are two very different things, but the NHL spin zone really will get you. And in a minute, we will be talking about recent form, teams like the Islanders, the Predators, the Red Wings, and Vegas. Grocery bills are so expensive these days, but now they don't have to be. Start getting cash back on your grocery shopping with the free I Bought A app and get cash back every single time you shop. I Bought A is a free app that gives you the most cash back every time you shop on hundreds of items from groceries to beauty supplies to toys, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average I Bought A user earns $256 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip. You can buy that flight you've been eyeing, that game you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. Other apps give you points that don't amount to a whole much. With iBoughta, just add your offers in the app, upload your receipt, and get real cash that you can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. Join the over 50 million users and get cash back every time you shop from over 2,700 brands and retailers, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, iBoughta is offering our listeners $5 for just trying iBoughta by using the code LOCKEDONNHL when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free iBoughta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONNHL. That's iBoughta in the Google Play or Apple Store and use code LOCKEDONNHL. As you know, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel, Locked On Sports Today. Baseball fans, mark your calendars for March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern for the best MLB season preview coming exclusively to Locked On Sports Today. On March 20th at 7 p.m., be the first to get local insight from the MLB local experts of the Locked On Podcast Network. Find it on March 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern on the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon TV Fire Channels app. Hunter, we are now at a point where I think we're more or less set on the mix of teams that are going to be in the conversation, but teams we didn't get to touch on a lot in the first segment that we're going to talk about now, teams like the Islanders and the Predators, who have been really good over the last month. I know in the context of the Islanders, a lot of people were waiting for that new coach bump to happen, which generally happens where even if it's not really authentic, teams generally do get a nice bump in performance when they change coaches. It's usually a sugar high that doesn't sustain long term. But some of the choices Patrick Waugh's made that we're going to talk about in a minute are really interesting. Nashville canceling their trip to see U2 in Vegas really kind of swung their season, apparently, if you believe that narrative. That's a team littered with guys who have experience, that team's not overly talented, but it just has a lot of pros, and that's not lost on the monotony of a long season when you have a team with guys who've won Stanley Cups in other places. They have a funny way of kind of keeping everything in line and knowing exactly what buttons to push. But I find it really interesting because a month or two ago, I would say about 6 weeks ago, we were both ready to say the Islanders and Predators should probably be selling at the deadline.
I agree. And then you saw, the Islanders didn't really do anything at the deadline just because Lou Lamoriello, I think, sleeps through every trade deadline at this point overall. But the Predators, Barry Trotz, he decided to reward his team with a couple of moves. He got Anthony Beauvillier, who I think is a fine bottom six, potentially middle six player. And then Jason Zucker for a 6th round pick? Really? For a guy who can usually score 20 goals in the NHL? That's all it took to get him out from Arizona. Just a very weird market took place this year, Nick. I thought it was going to be a seller's market, but it turned into a buyer's market pretty quickly at the NHL trade deadline. And I really like that move for Trotz and the Predators. Nashville, they may not be close to the best team in the Western Conference, but they do have players that can hurt you in the lineup. Even outside of Zucker, Philip Forsberg's having an incredible year. Ryan O'Reilly, while I don't think he's as good as he used to be, he is still a pretty solid top six center. Gustav Nyquist. And then defensively, you know what you're going to get from Roman Josi. Ryan McDonough, while I don't think he's a true top pairing defenseman anymore, he is still a player that can handle at least top 4 minutes, maybe not top pair minutes, but I think top 4 overall. And then as long as you have UC Saros, you have a shot to win most games. And while if they make the playoffs, which I think they will, I don't think they're going to go too far, but I think as long as Saros plays at a high level, they'll have a shot to potentially steal some games, if not a series, just because he has that ability. He's one of the 5 best goaltenders on the planet. The Islanders, really over these last couple of weeks, they've really started to turn around. They had that 6-game winning streak recently. I know it was just snapped, but they're finally getting that new head coach bump. Kyle Palmieri has been great for them as of late. Noah Dobson has continued to play really well. I like that top line that Waugh has decided to roll out with Nelson, Horvat, and Barzell. I think uniting all 3 of those players together is a great decision, considering how I think those are the 3 best forwards on the team. You have Anders Lee with Pajot and Palmieri on their second line. And then you also broke up the quote-unquote identity line and you spread them out a little bit. That's the way to go, just because as a whole, the identity line is not nearly as good as it used to be. And who I'm talking about, Matt Martin, Cal Clutterbuck, and Casey Zizekas. And it also looks like Sorokin is starting to find his form a little bit more as well. And that could be scary potentially if this team makes playoffs, because we all know that he's a top 3 goalie in this league, at least in my opinion. Now, I don't think they're going to go far if they make the playoffs, but they're definitely in the conversation, to say the least, considering how bad the Red Wings have been, Nick. And just getting to that now, 6-game losing streak. They've been lifeless in a lot of these games. They just had a fight at practice. The vibes are really bad in Detroit, just because a couple weeks ago, we went on the show and said it was basically a guaranteed lock that the Red Wings were going to get into the playoffs and that the Atlantic was going to be taking 5 teams. Now, I'm not necessarily so sure that that is the case at this one because the Red Wings have been playing really ugly hockey as of late.
No Dylan Larkin has really hurt them. I mean,
Yeah.
they're a very top-heavy team where they have, 2 or 3 good players, and they carry a lot of the load. And the rest of that group, if they're not on their game, it's a pretty weak group. We talk a lot about they've had a nice resurgence, they had a nice story this year, but this is still a team that's really, really just limited. I mean, even with Dylan Larkin in the mix, we're talking about a team, and with Dylan Larkin, it's him, DeBrincat, Patrick Kane, like, and Lucas Raymond, that's fine. That's not a bad first 4 forward group. But when you look around the rest of that group, man, JT Compher and David Perron and Andrew Kopp and Robbie Fabry, those guys are all fine. But those guys don't have a lot of room. Like, they don't have a lot of range of outcomes. Their back end,
They need more high-end talent.
they do, frankly. And when you're missing one of your better players in Larkin, who goes under the radar a lot because he doesn't put up gaudy counting stats because that's just not the type of player he is. When you're missing one of your key guys, it's really hard to cope. And they're a team that was out shooting their metrics for most of the season. They were riding a really strong shooting season from a handful of guys. You drop one of those really talented guys out of there, and then you look at that defense, and you understand, Sherratt, Petrie, Gostisbehere, none of those guys is playing shutdown defense. Those are guys who are going to trade chances, pick up the tempo, and make the game a little bit more make that game a little more high scoring, but it's not going to help you defensively. And when your goaltending situation looks what it does, it's going to be really hard for them to win a lot of games where they don't have their high end guys. We got about a minute left in the segment. So if you have anything else you want to get in real quick.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there pretty good. I don't think there's too many other teams that we can discuss for the recent form for the wild card race. I mean, if you want to throw Washington in there, Nick, we can. I mean, they're definitely
a nice story.
More in the race, but I don't think they're going to make the playoffs.
We could do Buffalo. Buffalo's only 5 points out of that last spot, even though they're not particularly good.
No, yeah, they've woken up. They've won 6 of the last 10 games, 2 in a row. They're not as close as they were last year, but they've been able to get themselves back into the conversation. Pittsburgh, I feel like, is cooked right now, but if they somehow are able to go on a 4 to 5 game heater, even though they have not really done that at all this season, they've only gone on a 5-game winning streak once, but if they're able to somehow do that, they'll be able to get back in the conversation, but I just don't trust them to do that with their recent form. Ever since Gensel got traded, they look like they just kind of waved the white flag. And, you look at that Western Conference wildcard race just real quickly, I feel like we know who's going to make the playoffs in the West. I don't see the Blues overcoming a 6-point deficit with only 16 games to go. Same with the Minnesota Wild, and then the Seattle Kraken. I think they're cooked this year as well. So I think we know all of the playoff teams in the Western Conference. The East, still a couple of questions. It's a bit tighter in the East overall, but should be an interesting race here down the stretch. I just don't know if I fully see a lot of the wild card teams in both conferences making noise, unless Vegas gets wild card too, which that would be a bad thing for the Canucks, as I've said so many times on the show.
For sure. And we will be right back. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar transfer in other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. And as we wrap up today's show, I want to thank everybody who's hanging out with us. We've got the NHL covered every single day on the Locked On NHL feed. We're in the stretch run now. You know, most teams have something in the neighborhood of 15 games to go. We've got about 3 calendar weeks remaining in the regular season. And for the most part, things kind of have settled down, barring something unforeseen. It feels like we're relatively stable. You know, most of the teams that are in these playoff spots, they're going to be in these playoff spots come the end of the season. It's just a matter of where they end up. But at the bottom end of the pecking order, the teams that have really just fallen off a cliff, you know, Ottawa came into this season with a lot of buzz. Arizona was in a playoff spot around Christmas. They're one of the teams that fell out of one. Montreal, you know, very much mired in a rebuilding season. Pittsburgh underperformed. New Jersey has underperformed. Buffalo has underperformed. And I find it interesting that when you go and look at the bottom 10 of the standings this year, there are a lot of teams that just underperformed. It's not that they're untalented or not good. It's just they haven't met their preseason expectations.
I agree. You know, I was really high on the Sabres heading into the season. I actually had them making the playoffs this year. I thought this was their time to get in. I thought Devin Levi was going to be the truth. I thought they had good forward depth, especially after last year. I thought their defense was going to be really solid, but they just haven't been able to get over the hump at all yet again. And that just, it goes to show how hard it is to take that next step in the NHL. And for the Penguins especially, yeah, I mean, I had them as at least a wild card team. I had them fighting for a top 3 spot in the Metropolitan Division heading into the season. I will gladly take the L on that. I did not see this season coming from them at all. And the Devils, I mean, I had them top 3 in the Metro for sure this season, but they just haven't been able to get good goaltending at all. The forwards are there. The defense is there, at least when healthy. And I know Dougie Hamilton's been out for most of the season, which has really crushed them, but they just haven't been able to get a save from any of their goaltenders this season. So that's going to be high on the list of priorities for the Devils once this season comes to an end. But I agree with you completely. If we're voting, you know, teams off the island, I think we might have to start in the West and vote Arizona off. I don't think we voted them off just yet. You're right. They were in a playoff spot right around the Christmas break, and I had them fighting for a playoff spot for most of the year heading into the season. I like the talent that they have out there in Arizona. I like their top 6 especially, but once the new year started and once they got into February, they went on that massively long losing streak, and that just killed any hope that they maybe had of potentially sneaking into a wild card spot in the Western Conference. They ended up selling a little bit at the trade deadline. This team is still a little bit of a ways away from contending for a playoff spot, at least right now. So I vote to have them off the island from the Western Conference.
Arizona is just every year you want to see incremental progress. That's the big thing with the teams that are perpetually rebuilding. And we talked about this on Locked On Flames, Jess and I, the other day. You know, it's great you took the step to say, hey, we're going to rebuild. We need to sell guys off. But eventually there needs to be some form of progress. You know, eventually you need to see your young guys start to take bigger responsibilities. And Arizona, you know, I like Matthias McKelly. I like Clayton Keller. Valimaki has been a nice find for them. But they don't have a lot of guys that overwhelmingly are developing at a pace that feels good. And yeah, they have 1 million draft picks. They have tons of cap space. All of that is great. You know, you want that group to eventually start to take some steps. You hope Armstrong is going to start using all of these picks to turn them into roster players eventually. You know, it's great you have draft picks, it's great you have prospects, but if they don't become players, it doesn't mean anything. You can rebuild indefinitely if you really, really tried, if you don't hit on your draft picks and you don't put them in a position to succeed. And that kind of feels what's happening in Arizona. You could say the same thing about Ottawa, where they have talent on that team, but they've massively underperformed. They put their chips on Jonas Corposalo as their goalie, and that's epically bombed out. They have talent on that team, but it hasn't worked again. They fired their coach in season. I doubt Jacques Martin is going to be the full-time coach going into next season. They still don't know if Steos is going to be the full-time GM or if they're going to get somebody else to do that. There's a lot of unsettled business there. Columbus, we talked about last week, is just being a team where there's talent on that team, but the vibes and the environment are so rancid, it's basically impossible to be successful. there are a lot of teams that fall into that trap of, yeah, we're rebuilding, and real quick 5 years go by.
Right. No, I agree. I agree with you completely. Some of these rebuilds just take a lot longer than teams think they will. And heck, I mean, I already talked about the Sabres. I mean, they've been trying to get back to the playoffs for over a decade at this point, and they still haven't been able to, and they probably aren't going to make the playoffs again this season. Again, it just goes to show how hard it is to take that next step in the league. Who do you vote to get off the island from the Eastern Conference?
We can get Ottawa out of here.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they had lost 7 in a row before they beat the Penguins in overtime, just because, of course, the Penguins had to lose that game as someone who covers the team. But when I was watching that game, I saw a team that makes a lot of mistakes defensively, which is weird from a Jacques Martin team because he preaches defense all the time. Like, he loves to, slow the game down, defense first. That's always how he's been as a head coach. But that team makes so many mistakes. They have quite a bit of young talent. They just need the right coach in there to be able to coach them up. And I still think they need more high-end talent for that lineup to begin with. I think they need a more stable GM in there as well. Someone that's obviously a lot better than Pierre Dorian. And we'll have to see if Staios is that guy. But they need to make quite a few changes this offseason.
Oh, yeah. Anytime you underperform expectations multiple seasons in a row, you got to take a fundamental reevaluation of everything you're doing as a franchise, because there's more than enough talent on Ottawa's team to be competitive. I'm not saying you have to make the playoffs, but they are way too bad for the amount of talent they have, especially up at forward. When you have a team that has a pretty solid top 6 and has 2 or 3 pretty decent defensemen, I know your goaltending is awful, but you can help your goaltending out by playing a little bit better. I mean, when Martin first got that job, I remember reading a feature in The Athletic where that was one of the first things he said when he took over the team. It doesn't matter who plays goalie for us. They always get worse. We can't be the team that becomes the goalie graveyard because we're never going to be able to get anybody who wants to be here long term. But that will just about do it. I know, Hunter, we could go on and on all day, but we unfortunately do have time constraints. So that will just about do it for today's edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. Drop the show a 5-star review if you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you are over on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video. Hunter and I will see you guys next